Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Noirwich Crime Writing Festival 2020. Noirwich Crime Writing Festival is a partnership between National Centre for Writing and the University of East Anglia. A huge thank you to Arts Council England and to this year's festival supporters, Dead Good Books and the Crime Vault for making this event possible. My name is Flo Reynolds and I'm Programme Officer at the National Centre for Writing. I want to thank you for joining us for this very special event in which we welcome Oyinkan Braithwaite, author of the international bestseller, My Sister, the Serial Killer. Oyinkan will be interviewed by author Femi Kayode, and without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Femi.
Hi, how are you? I'm Femi. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm so excited to be talking to Oyinkan today. Oyinkan, I don't want to go too much into who I am, what I am. I really am so excited to meet you finally, albeit on Zoom. We've been having a conversation on WhatsApp over the past week since we knew this was going to happen. So I'm so excited to finally see you. Thank you for joining me today. As you know, I'm a bit excited and a bit nervous about this. So you've tried to calm me down. You told me that I should just ask anything I want to know. So what I want to start off with is just maybe if you can just tell me that really wants to get to know you just a bit about yourself, not as Oyinkan the author, but just Oyinkan the person, you know, where you stay, where you're from and things like that.
Okay, well, I'm in Lagos right now. I'm in Lagos, Nigeria. And I guess we're sort of coming out of the strict lockdown measures bit by bit. And I'm from Nigeria as well. I'm also British. This is always so hard.
I put you on the spot.
I'm already drawing a blank. I'm like, okay, I said the places I'm from.
Okay.
You know, okay, I love anime. That's one of the things. I don't know if that's like my most defining. These days, it sounds like it's my most defining feature because every opportunity, I'm like, I'm an anime fan. I'm a huge fan of anime. In fact, these days, it's one of the only things I can watch because the world is so, even though I guess there's some really dark anime, but even the really dark anime I've kind of shied away from, like so I watch a lot of anime, consume a lot of anime. What else is there? This is hard.
I know, it's fine. I understand. I'm already
hard.
excited. Yeah, I mean, I am actually already excited about the idea of being very much a fan of anime. Because it really tells a lot. You know, there was a time I was talking to somebody and he said that I'm very addicted to CBBS. I was like, what? You know, CBBS. And it's like, no, you know, you just get back from home from a hard day's work and then you just sit down and just watch
CBBS. Did he have kids or
he didn't have kids?
He just started that by himself.
Yeah, it was like some kind of a therapy for him to unwind at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But
no, I get that.
Yeah, and I think what you just said really, really helps me to segue into what I really wanted to start the conversation with, which is that where the world is right now, you know, the whole COVID-19 and all that, and how is that affecting your state of mind, your sense of being, and how you see the world. You know, does the veil that you have or the lens through which you see people and the world, has it changed much, or is it the same, or are people being exactly who you always thought they were during this time of crisis? Well, I don't know. I just want to get your opinion there.
Well, as for my state of mind, one of the things I've realized is that it's really hard for me to consume long works of fiction. So I've been reading a lot of shorts and novellas. For some reason, I can't focus enough to be like, I'm reading this from beginning to end. I know there's a lot going on and you know, it's a struggle for me. But as for how I see people, I don't think that's really changed. One of the things I think about as a writer is what people do one of the things that fascinate me is kind of seeing what people do when they're between a rock and a hard place, when they're pushed into a corner and that's kind of what I'm interested in when I'm creating characters. Like, what would they do if you put them in these extreme circumstances? So I don't think people have surprised me. If anything, like whenever I see, I note it more when I see people doing extreme acts of kindness, because for me that's more interesting, that's more notable than when people do extreme acts of cruelty, you know. So yeah, I don't know, that's kind of where I'm
no
at.
That's interesting. I think for me, what the time has actually taught me is that I have very little patience for conspiracy theories, you know. So I tend to like, I would read it and I'm like, oh my God, you really think this, you know? And I think the season has actually brought that up. But that also gets to the issue of conflicts. You know, a very good friend of mine once defined conflict in drama as desire versus danger. You know, and when you just talk about the issue of, you know, between a rock and a hard place, I'm just thinking to myself, how does that concept of between the rock and a hard place, how does it start as a theme for you as a writer when you're creating these characters? What kind of hard and rock place comes to your mind first? Kind of thing.
I guess it's just something I keep coming back to. I think for me it's about relationship most of the time, you know. It's about relationship and you know, when a relationship has broken down, or betrayal, you know, what forces somebody to betray their sister or their husband, or what forces even something like cheating, what you know, as sort of commonplace as that is, what drives a person to do that. So this is what it is, I think, for me most of the time, how a person represents themselves versus who they actually are when things, you know, go sideways. When things go sideways, who are they really? And I think that's even, again, coming back to the pandemic, I think, you know, it's funny because some people may have found themselves doing things that a year ago they would have said, I would never do that, this is not me. And even as our journey, you know, from childhood to adulthood, there's some things 10 years ago I said I'd never say that, or I'd never do this particular thing, and then you do it and you're like, oh, you know. So yeah, that's kind of my mind.
So in a sense, the rock and a hard place is relative to character at the end of the day. You know, because what's a rock and a hard place for me within a relationship? My non-negotiables are different from the next person, and that's a very fascinating thing, especially when we now take it to my sister, the serial killer. Because this is a rock and a hard place that a lot of people would say, I can't relate to that. You know, my sister is not a serial killer. But what I loved about the book, what I really, really, really enjoyed about the book was this sense of, what if it was me? What choices would I make? You know, what if I found myself in this untenable situation? And I think you did it so beautifully without judgment. And I thought that was just so beautiful. And so that's why I want to start with that my sister the serial killer is the best thing I've read in a very, very long time. It was quick. I just stayed up all night and I just read it, you know, and all that. And it was a very, very simple prose, very, very accessible prose. And I just wanted to know, was that the intention? Did you start off saying, I just want to write something simple, or I just want to create a character that is between this rock and a hard place, and then just flow with it? How did it come to you, in a sense?
Okay, well, generally speaking, I think that I don't know. I was going to say that I think I'm more of a storyteller than I am necessarily a writer, but that's not strictly true, because words fascinate me, you know, and like, not words by themselves, but words, how you arrange them to, you know, because you can arrange the same 5 words probably in different ways, and it will trigger different emotions. Or I hope I'm making sense.
You are making sense. Absolutely.
But when I say I think I'm more of a storyteller, is that at the heart, when I'm writing, it's about for me, it's really about the engagement value, you know. Is it engaging me from start to finish? Because if it's not, then, you know, there's almost no point in the work at all. And it's a struggle for me to keep on writing something that's, you know, that's dragging. So I think that's my first thing. When I was writing My Sister the Serial Killer, I wrote My Sister the Serial Killer for myself. And I know that sounds like maybe I'm saying I tricked myself, but I didn't. I actually wrote it with the intention that, you know, it would help me come out of the writer's block that I was experiencing at the time. So I didn't write it with the intention that I would send it to an agent. I didn't write it with the intention that, you know, lots of people would be able to access it. And when I wrote the first version of My Sister's Serial Killer, which was a novella, it was half the size it is now. I self-published it, and then I did a few little Instagram posts about it, and that was it. Because again, I wasn't even trying to push the work like, you know, that much. So I think that's what really gave me, I mean, I almost feel like when I think about it, I feel as if, you know, My Sister's Serial Killer will always be special to me, because I'm never going to get that again, that freedom to, you know, knowing that, oh, nobody is going to see this, or, you know, and to be free to try whatever I wanted to try. For example, the fact that, you know, like chapter 1 is just 2 sentences. That's something I would not have done if I thought I was going to send it to an agent eventually, you know, because I thought, I would have thought nobody would buy into that. You know, why would your first chapter? And it wasn't really something I had seen. Like, you see kind of prologues that are mini, but it wasn't, and it's not even just my first chapter. I have other chapters that are just, you know, a paragraph here.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, it did give me a kind of freedom to do whatever I felt I wanted to do.
Yeah, I think I understand that freedom, and it's just something that happened to me when the very first time I got paid for writing, and the next time just to write an email was like this pressure that I felt. And I kept on saying, well, where is this coming from? And I realized that suddenly it just seemed as if I was on display. And I can understand the pressure. But what really excites me about what you're saying is really the idea that you're more of a storyteller than a writer. And I do really, really identify with that a lot, because sometimes I think maybe, especially when you do an MA in creative writing, and then you read all of this really great writers who are very adept at mixing the words and putting it together and to evoke the right emotions. And then you think about the books that you started out with, you know, the Mills and Booms, the James Hadley Chases, and all of that. And you realize that you didn't like them because they were good writers. You liked them because they were great stories, you know, in a sense. So I really identify with that. But I think with that said, I also want to find out, like, those early influences that made you feel that you were a storyteller, that made you feel as if you wanted to tell stories just like this. You know, do you want to give me an idea?
Gosh, I don't know what particular book made me think that I want to be a writer. I think I was just a voracious reader, and at some point I just thought this is what I'm meant to do. You know, I read a lot of classics. My favorite book in the whole world is still Jane Eyre. I read that when I was about 10, and my love for it has not waned in any way, shape, or form. So people are kind of surprised sometimes when I say Jane Eyre, because I guess because it's the type of story kind of stories I write, but it is, you know, and I suppose, I don't know, I read a lot of the classics. One book that I think might have been a kind of influence on My Sister's Serial Killer was it Great Expectations? You know, that had Estella, you know, who was groomed to basically be a heartbreaker. Like, I feel like she's almost like a white, less murderous version of Ayoola, somewhat. Well, less murderous, less cookie version of Ayoola, but the intention was the same. That her what's the word for forgive the words now.
Go on.
If you're because Estella was the ward. So trying to think what
the mentor, the groomer.
well, let's call it
I
Uma
can't
for now.
remember.
I can't remember. But anyway, the woman who was bringing her up, you know, her heart, she had been left at the altar.
At the altar.
Her heart had been broken, and you know, she basically wore her wedding dress for the rest of her life.
Mrs.
And
Havisham.
Miss Havisham, there we go. But I don't know what her title would have been for Estella. Anyway, Miss Havisham, you know, she wore the wedding dress pretty much her entire life, and she kind of cultivated this bitterness and this anger, and you know, passed it on to Estella. You know, and I think there was something that resonated. Like the story was so powerful to me and so dark when I was, you know, I read a lot of dark stuff now that I think about it, but it resonated with me. And I actually feel like sometimes when I think about it, I'm like, I think that influenced my sister's serial killer in some way as well.
Yeah, which is very interesting. I mean, I've read quite a lot of literature or a lot of articles or reviews on My Sister the Serial Killer, and the Jane Austen influence has been pointed out in one or two articles, but I've never heard of the Great Expectations one, and it's a very weird analogy because it's supposed to be like really great literature, very well written, and all that. And it's strange again that you went straight to the story. You were not talking about the style of writing. I mean, even the size of the book compared to the size of this one, you know, actually shows that there's a difference, but that your instinct is very much very storytelling, very character driven, and putting those characters in very difficult situations where they have to make choices.
The thing about Great Expectations, I think, is that they had, which to be honest is something that matters to me, my writing, and mattered quite, and I think Great Expectations did quite well, was the dialogue. You know, the dialogue was quite was memorable to my mind. The Jane Austen influences, I've never actually mentioned, I think that's just people kind of, I've never mentioned Jane Austen, even though obviously I did read her. To be honest, I actually think I've watched more Jane Austen than I've actually read Jane Austen. But, you know, I think people make the connection because of the whole marriage and, you know, it being, you know, mostly women, that sort of thing. But it's not a comparison I would have made on my own.
On your own, okay. And let me talk about the process of the writing. So do you free flow? Do you plot? Do you carefully know exactly what's going to happen next, or do you? I'm just curious as to that.
Most of the time I don't plan. I like to see where the first sentence and the sentence after that is going to take me. I kind of, again, it makes it a little bit more fun for me, because sometimes I realize that if I try to plot everything out, then I lose interest, because I feel like I've kind of told the story and there's not, everything else just will work. So most of the time I don't, but some stories you kind of have to plan them. Like I did a novella recently, and I realized that at first I thought I could get away with not knowing who the perpetrator was, for lack of a better word. And then I realized that no, I actually have to know. I have to know pretty much right at the start. I can't get away with figuring out with the reader. So that one I didn't plot the whole thing, but I had to know who did what. So I had to work that out. So yeah, I think mostly it depends on the story. I did an interview recently, and fantastic writers on there, and you know, it was mentioned that if you're doing a story that's going to have, you know, the reveal, like twists, and you've got to plot those out, because otherwise it will, you know, you'll be able to like poke a hole in it and the whole thing will fall apart. So
well, it's very interesting, because I remember when I finished school in crime fiction, I just kept saying, there's something they didn't tell us. And everybody goes, what didn't they tell us? I'm like, they didn't tell us that the first thing you must figure out is how the crime was committed. That before you write your first chapter, you must figure out how the crime was committed. And speaking to what you just said now, I always just thought that this was something you could get away with and sort of like figure it out as you go along. And then you sort of like hit the spot. And you're like, no, you really have to have figured how the crime was committed before moving on. And I think talking
Yeah,
about
because
crime then
everything
makes,
builds up to it. So you can't, if you
yeah,
don't know everything and you leave for a lot of crime, you know, like I watch a lot of crime stuff, and I realized the ones I like the most are the ones that, even if I didn't figure out who did it, when they tell me, I'm like, oh, yes, you know, and everything adds up. But if
adds
you've
up,
not left me anything, you've not left me any herring bones here or whatever,
breadcrumbs, yeah.
yeah, you've not left me any breadcrumbs, then I don't have the same
Yeah.
emotional satisfaction at the end
Uh,
of it.
yeah.
So yeah, I agree with
And
you.
that speaks to this whole idea of crime as a genre. And I wanted to talk about it quickly with you in terms of um, My Sister the Serial Killer was put in the crime genre, but more and more it's being placed within the context of the literary genre. I don't really know the difference, but I just want to know what you think about that. You know, when a writer sets out to tell a particular kind of story, and then when it goes out into the world, it's seen as either something more or something else. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing My Sister Circle, I didn't think of genre at all.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, even though I can see why it's placed in the crime genre, I can also see why sometimes it's not. For one thing, you know, we just spoke about plotting crime and, you know, planning out you know, how the murder took place. My Sister Killer isn't like that. You know from the get-go who committed it, and then the how it was committed is never really um
Mm-hmm.
not there's not much focus placed on it. So
Mm-hmm.
essentially it's not even about the murders, it's really about the relationship between these two women.
Mm-hmm.
And for me it's really about Korede's journey, you know, between sort of being in denial and then accepting, you know, who her sister is and what her role in that
Mm-hmm.
whole situation is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why it
Yeah.
straddles it, because if you're
Mm-hmm.
looking for pure crime, again, you're not going to be satisfied because that's not
Yeah.
what My Sister Serial Killer is going to give you. I've even seen some readers be disappointed because they thought there would be more gore, because obviously it's called My Sister Serial Killer, and then they get there and they realize there's actually very little gore at
Serial
all.
killing. Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
again, for me, it's more about that story is more about relationship than anything
Mm-hmm.
else. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the murders are almost a side note in like a bigger sort of
Yeah. The
yeah.
context. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think for me, I think that's one of the things that I've always sort of like wondered about what, you know, what is literary and what is crime and what is genre. And I love the fact that when you in terms of your process starts to write, you're not thinking about a genre, you just want to tell a story. And I think that's where one should just always start for to be authentic to the story. And now let's talk about the editing process. Okay, so I'm just finished editing my book now. It was a painful experience because I didn't know anything about the publishing process until now. And my background was always in film. And so what I wanted to find out from you is that editing this beautifully already sparse book, how was it? How did you feel? How can you just, and this is something that a lot of the writers that I've spoken to want to ask you. You know, what was your editing process like? What was the experience like? And did you learn anything? And will it shape the next story or your approach to the next story?
I think, I mean, to be honest, the editing process for me was really smooth.
Mm,
I was working with two editors at once because we were bringing out the UK and the US about the same time. So I was working with one UK editor, one US editor. So it was the three of us, three different time zones. And it could have been really stressful, but I think we were all very patient with one another. And like you said, my writing is quite sparse. So most of the time, what they're asking me to do isn't so much take things out. They're encouraging me to flesh things out.
okay.
So, you know, more than anything, they'll be like, oh, you've not told us enough about this, or you've not told us enough about that, which, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I know that I know that's something I do, because a lot of the time I'm like, oh, the reader gets it. They know. They know. They can fill in the blanks. They're like, no,
Uh-huh.
we just need a little bit more.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, because I think for me, less is always more in my mind. You know, I write a sentence and I'm like, oh, they get it. but sometimes you do need to, and especially like I'm terrible when it comes to describe setting. If I could put my characters in a vacuum and just have them talk to one another, that would be my preferred way to go. So I never really want to place them anywhere. I've had some people ask me like, oh, yes, it was in Lagos and we enjoyed that, but it could have been anywhere. Did you do that intentionally? No, I didn't do it intentionally. It's because I'm lazy with description. And so that's why it feels like it could be anywhere, because I don't expatiate a lot on setting. That's not my priority. Is always dialogue and just a general tone of the piece. And I suppose also maybe it's because I wrote poetry for years and years and years. Not so much anymore, but I used to do a lot of poetry and spoken word. So I think that also teaches you. And I used to love doing the poetic forms like sonnets and sestinas and villanelles, and those kind of train you to be very specific about your word choice, because you don't have a lot of room to waffle or so everything you do with intention. And I think that's something I've carried over to my prose. But again, to answer your question about whether editing was difficult, I've also worked as an assistant editor, so I could edit my work fairly well even before people kind of join what I've done.
That's great. And I think you've said so many things that is leading to the next question, and that is this idea of cultural context. Again, I'm excited to ask this question because it was something that I went through so many workshops in school whereby I would write and the only Nigerian in the class, and they would say, we don't get it. We don't know what you're talking about. And I'd be like, yeah, but if I explain it to you, then I'm not telling the story. Then I'm doing a travelogue, or I'm doing something else entirely. And I was very, very fascinated about how you were so confidently alluding to several cultural contexts in terms of the names of the food, the bus stops, I cannot forget the part where you talked about Korede being stopped by LASMA. And I kept on waiting for the time when you're going to explain what LASMA is, and you didn't. And I was like, I just stomped up in the air. I was like, yes, she did it, And so what I wanted to know is, what kind of pushback did you get, when you gave it to your editors, for instance, to say, oh, explain this. What does this really mean? And how did you also push back to say, that's how it is? And I hope I make sense in terms of what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, you do. Okay. To be honest, I don't think I got a lot of pushback. I think that, I don't know, I feel like the story tells you where it's, I don't know. I didn't really get that much pushback. Partly because like the writers, who've come before us, a lot of them have fought those battles. I remember when I was maybe a few years before my serial killer came out, and I was writing another piece, a novel or something, and my brother, who's 13 years younger than me, would come in and he would maybe read like 4 sentences, and he would be like, well, is this going to appeal to a global market? I'd be like, get out of my room now. But I think generally I just try to be true to myself. I don't even feel like I try to be true to Nigeria as a whole. I try to be true to who I am. And when my editors came on board, I think they even encouraged me, sort of, because like I said, there was a lot of fleshing out to be done, and they encouraged me, like, look, this is a different time now. Be free. And was actually in the previous draft. There's a sentence in my sister's serial killer that's in Yoruba that I don't translate at all. A few sentences in the chapter with when I don't know if this is it's not a spoiler. I don't think it's a spoiler. I don't know. But when
it's not a spoiler.
When the father brings a mistress into the
A
house,
mistress can,
and
yeah.
the mother says, she says something in Yoruba,
Yeah.
and I didn't translate it, and nobody said. I think I might have been like, I don't want to translate this, and nobody said anything. And you know what? When I've come across readers who've had an issue with the fact that I didn't translate it, and I feel like, you know what? Two things. I actually feel there are two things. One, I've read books, maybe sentences in French, and I've had to go to Google and Google it. That's one. Two,
Yeah.
and I've not had an issue with it. Two, why I thought I could get away with that is because, again, maybe because my own is always less is more. So I thought I could get away with it because I was like, look, even if you don't understand what this woman is saying, you understand what she's saying, because the emotion of the scene, what she's going through is so tragic and so horrible that you don't need, if you just saw a woman screaming in the street and her hair, when she's pulling her hair and her wrapper or whatever is falling off, what this woman is saying, even though you don't know what she's saying,
Yeah.
So for me, it adds to it. It doesn't take away from it. I don't need to understand, and again, because I'm a big less is more person, I don't like, you spoke about the lasma. I don't like how clunky things get when you start saying, and lasma is, and you now have to start explaining your lasma.
Yeah.
Like, for me, that takes away from the story. It slows things down. And if you're really curious, again, you will get that he's some kind of police official. But if you are really curious, again, Google is your friend. But you don't need to know exactly what LASMA stands for in order to get what you need to get from that scene.
Yeah. And I think that is really, I think that's really what speaks to the idea of setting. I actually think that you actually set up your setting so beautifully because they're integral to the action. That's what I love about it. I maybe because I'm Nigerian, but I could see the road, I could see the lasma, I could smell the sweat, I could smell it. But there were information that were given relevant to the character and to the action and to the conflict in that setting. So you're not describing the size of a window simply because you want to talk about how beautiful the house is, but we get a very strong sense of where the characters are, and I can see the kitchen when the house girl is cooking because you relate the action of the house girl to the specific thing she's pointing to.
The thing about that, what you're saying is actually completely true, because I think it's something else that, again, because I said I don't like to describe a room, what I think I am conscious of as a writer is that, you talked about it being integral to the character. When you enter a room, in my opinion, your prejudices, your background, your mood affects what it is about that room that you remember when you leave. You're not going to remember the whole thing. You're going to be like, oh my goodness, I've never, seen a statue so big. And maybe that's because you're into garish things or tacky things. I don't know I'm not saying this is statue. I'm just saying, like, if you, whatever. Like, let's say there's this really gold and purple statue or whatever, and that attracts your eye because that's what you're attracted to as an individual. You may not notice that, above that, there's a flower streaming down from the ceiling because or maybe you'll notice it because you're like, what's wrong with these people? Why are they putting flowers? But you won't. It's not everything that's gonna, attract you.
Yeah, I really like that. And so maybe that speaks to because when I also read it, I also felt the strong sense of like I was watching a movie, and some of the critics or the reviewers have said that it does read very much like a screenplay. And I don't know what you think about that, because I thought it was
Sorry, can you repeat that? It cut for a second. I didn't hear. You said some of the critics.
Okay. I don't want to say critics. I would say reviewers said that the book read very much like a screenplay, like a very visual. And I think that what they're trying to say is that it's a very visual story. And when we're talking about the whole idea of the setting, for instance, and you're not setting, it actually is beautiful because your less is more actually works, because this whole idea of seeing it through the eyes of the character in that scene comes across very clearly. So did you plan to write in the present tense? And did you appreciate the fact that that present tense immediately puts people in the scene like a movie? Or is it something that came later?
Actually, funny enough, I think a few months after my sister serial killer came out, I read an article that was talking about present tense versus past tense. And the article actually said that present tense lends itself to feeling like you're watching a movie because you're in the action as it's happening. Now, that's not something I thought about now I get it. But then when I was writing my sister's serial killer, what actually happened was whenever I start a new writing project, I try to do something I've not done before or I wouldn't usually do, just because, again, another thing for me writing is to constantly grow and constantly improve my writing muscles. So I wrote in present tense because it was a tense I didn't usually write in. And that was it. I just wanted to try it and see. Now I'm quite used to it. Sometimes I do past tense, sometimes I do present tense, but that was my intention. I was like, I don't usually do present tense. And again, like I said, I wasn't writing this with the intention to have it published per se. So I was free to try things. Again, something else I tried that I didn't normally do was I didn't normally write in first person point of view. So I was like, I'm gonna try to do this, and I'm gonna try and do it in present tense, and and there were a couple of things that were on my mind, and that was it for me. It was me just trying out things I wouldn't normally do.
Strange that you spoke about present tense and first person, and I'm just going to ask about point of view. The whole idea of, everybody keeps asking, why did you choose Korede's point of view? Why not through Ayoola's point of view? Why not through the mother's point of view? Why not multiple point of views? I'm just curious, what do you have to say about that? Did you find Korede limiting, or did it free you to explore other issues? I'm just curious. I have my ideas as to what it would have done for you if I was doing that, but I was just very curious as to whether it's a conscious choice, and if it's a conscious choice, what challenges did you experience after making that choice and sticking to it?
It was a conscious choice. I think I chose Korede for two reasons. One, partly because she's so obsessed with Ayoola in her own way. So she's almost telling Ayoola's story more than she's telling her own story. And that makes her almost kind of like a limited third person point of view, which was my way of helping myself back to where I was comfortable, if that makes sense. So, she's almost not even an active character in that story. Things happen to her, more than, she's not really a catalyst. Ayoola's the catalyst, and then she responds, but mostly she's reporting. She's observing and reporting almost. So she's kind of like a limited third person in my mind. So that's how I kind of got away from, because I didn't want it to be, this is why I've always been afraid of first person point of view. I didn't want it to be, I did this and I did that, and then I felt sad, and then, because I don't want to sound like, some people do it brilliantly, but there's sometimes when you read first person point of view, at least, and even my attempts writing it in the past, where it just sounds like a teenager writing a diary. And I wanted to get as far away from that as possible. So that's one reason why. Another reason why I chose her, actually, in addition to the first point, there's another classic that kind of also gave me an idea that it would work, which was Wuthering Heights. Because even though Heathcliff and was it Catherine, I think she was Catherine, were sort of like the main characters in the story, is being told by other people who are in the story, but who are not really a part of what's going on. So I knew it was possible. And then I think also it's Korede's story, at least in the way I ended up writing it. It is Korede's story. It is her journey in a way. So, and something else I do need to try, which I think I have to try multiple points of views. I've not really engaged with that so much.
Okay.
So that's something that I'll probably be like, one day I'll be like, oh, I'm gonna try this. But at the time, it wasn't one of the things I wanted to try.
Yeah, good. Okay. I think it's very interesting that you also spoke about Korede's journey. One of the things that the school of thought that characters change, and that I remember a very old professor of mine would always say things like, a character has changed when what he needs is not what he wants, and it was just very fascinating to me. And we spent so much time discussing how characters change, and that's how that the denouement or whatever, the ending of the story, then okay, now you're satisfied with the ending. But what I found out, what I felt in My Sister the Serial Killer is like, it's a journey, but it didn't end in a change. There was no change to, we knew the sister was a serial killer at the beginning. She was not caught. She didn't change. She didn't go into therapy. And Korede's choices remained consistent through it all. And so I was just curious, was that also something that's intentional? Do you feel that that's life? Is that how, do we change as people?
That's why sometimes I'm like, it's not really a crime, because nothing changes as far as the crimes are concerned. However, I disagree that Korede's choices remain the same, because her actions are consistent, but her emotional journey is different. So at the start of the novel, she's kind of like, what's going on? Hey, my sister's a serial killer. Oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? How are we mustn't get caught. And by the end of it, she's basically like, she's the sidekick. She's Ayola's, she's become Ayola's sidekick. She's at peace. She's cut off that part of herself that was fighting it. And she's like, you know what? It looks as if this is my life now, and she's kind of, she's on board, because a lot of people were like, oh my goodness, why didn't she end up with Mutar? Why didn't she, give him a chance or whatever? And then that was a choice she had, but she made a choice. So I think prior to that, this point where Ayoola says you can't sit on the fence, and I think that's what it is at the end. She has made a choice. It's just maybe not the choice that we would prefer that she made. But up until then, she's been like, back and forth.
Darling, back and forth. That's interesting. It's very, very interesting. I was reading it, and the times when I laughed out loud, I'm sure you can guess I'm a cinephile. I love watching movies, and I quickly related it to a movie that I really, really love, which is with Meryl Streep and Goldie Hawn. Is it Meryl Streep and Goldie Hawn? And it's called Death Becomes Her.
Yeah, I remember.
The darkness and the dialogue and all that, and how you're actually rooting for this women in a sense. And I thought it was just laugh out funny, and you have to stop yourself. No, why are you laughing at this? This is really dark. Stop laughing, kind of thing. So I had so much fun reading it. But I think within that same context is that whole idea of that whole Korede herself. I'm so fascinated by her because I'm personally in love with her. I really, really love her, and I see her as a statuesque, 6 foot tall, dark, beautiful. And I'm very fascinated as to what makes her think she is not attractive, and the things that maybe how you see her in your head. Is she really unattractive?
See,
or is it that she does not
answer this question, because this issue has gotten me into trouble sometimes. I think that, okay, so, it's funny you say that you see her as this beautiful statuesque, because I come across a reader once who said, I actually don't think Korede is ugly. I think she just thinks she is. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And somebody else messaged me the other day. I was very upset that I had made this unattractive character dark-skinned, and felt that I was adding to this to the message, yes, that dark-skinned women were not beautiful. to which I had to point her to my short stories, because I'm like, if you've read, like, you will see that that's not the case. But I could understand what she was saying about, my sister's serial killer. Now, I think that with Korede's issue is compounded by many things, I think. One, colorism, which is a real thing in Nigeria. I think we're veering away from it, at least I hope we are now, but it's a very real thing. And in many ways, my sister's serial killer, I represented things as I see them. So that's one thing where, some women were made to feel unattractive purely because they were, dark skinned. That might not necessarily mean that they were in fact unattractive. And even that stuff, people are, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So to some people you might be unattractive, to others you might be the best thing since sliced bread. So that's one. Two, something else I felt like I wanted to deal with writing not deal with, that sounds like I had intention. But something else that I covered kind of was, and it was something that used to happen because I went to boarding school in Nigeria for a year. And it was something that used to happen where people would number girls according to their physical body type, and just there was so many things that happened, when we were like 11, 12, 13, that I imagine, there are things there that impact you, in your early, because you're going through puberty then. So if you're told at that age that you are unattractive, that's going to stay with you. No matter how, much people say things, that will stay with you. It will, and then the third thing I think that compounded Korede's issue is the fact that she's got Ayoola for a sister. Because, again, people compare. I've been compared with my siblings. They've been compared with me. And I don't know to what purpose, but that's what people do. They compare, so even if you were good looking, if your sister has model type beauty, you will always be the unattractive sister. So I think her issues are kind of compounded by all those different things.
Yeah. And also by her age, right? By her position in the family as being the eldest, so sort of those responsibilities that are placed on her does not allow her to have the right amount of maybe almost self-love, doesn't allow her to be selfish enough, to be able to look at herself and actually judge herself by herself. I think it's a very
sorry, to add to that, actually, something else I was actually, because there were so many things writing my sister girl I wasn't conscious of. But something I was conscious of is that Korede actually rarely describes herself. And when she does, it's in comparison to
her mother.
Ayoola. But Ayoola kind of will tell you, she knows how beautiful, and Korede will tell you when Ayoola is half naked. She'll tell you what she's wearing on on a particular day. She'll tell you what bag she's carrying, but she doesn't focus a lot of that attention on her own self. So I agree.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you said the one time we got an impression as to what Korede looked like was when she described her mother. And I thought it was a very fascinating thing because, you're reading this book and the author is describing the character. And I'm like, okay, from whose point of view are you describing this character? And the first time I had a full picture of Korede was when the mom, she was describing her mom, the thick lips and the hips and all that. And I just got a sense that that's when I knew she was dark. That's when I knew she was all of those things. With that said, let's just look at this idea of, Korede, the mom, she had two daughters and Ayoola was so beautiful that she just gave up trying to have more kids. And I thought that was quite progressive, which made their father's behavior all the more shocking to me, because one would assume that he has these two princesses that he would guard and protect with his life, especially if he was the type of man that allowed his wife to decide not to have more kids because this last one was just too beautiful. I assume that there would be more complications that led to that, obviously. But in your typical sparse prose style, you didn't give us more information beyond that. However, I want to talk about this issue of patriarchy and the stereotype of the cheating. Okay, I didn't like the man, but he spoke to so much that I've read and I've heard about Nigerian or especially Yoruba fathers, and I was wondering, is this intentional? Because it's perhaps the most stereotypical part of your whole story. Every other thing sort of like angles out of the ordinary and the unique and the special, but this man was just so standard in a sense, in terms of literature or in terms of what we know. I don't know what you have to say about that. And is this something that you think about in terms of patriarchy? Is it something that you've experienced? And yeah,
actually, funny enough, when my dad read the story, at some point he was like, "Why is the dad so?" Yeah, when my dad read the story, he was like, "Why is the dad so mean?" And he was like, "Why is that?" And I was like, "Oh gosh." But yeah, I mean, the thing is that I was very, very fortunate to have two parents who kind of were quite liberal, at least by Nigerian standards. They were very liberal, and I mean, they have a rider for the daughter, so they've been okay, they've been cool. But I did see that I come across homes where the father will come home at night and everybody would disappear. Like they'll go, the TV will turn off, go to their rooms, and some of them actually didn't have terrible relationships with their father, but their father was also and the mothers encouraged it, this fear, once the father steps into the house, everything has to be, and sometimes even, but then there were some homes where the fathers were that strict and the mothers were also as afraid of their husbands as the kids were. So, I mean, I've seen it all in Nigeria. I've seen there's a range. I think we probably don't do enough celebrating the fathers who were doing it right, who were getting it, because they existed, they still do exist. But unfortunately, you also have on the other end of the scale, you have the other type of father. Now, in writing this, to be honest, I didn't write it with the intention to attack the patriarchy or even to address it. The father didn't actually even exist at the start of my story, but it got to a point where I realized that I needed, I wanted Korede and Ayoola to experience trauma together, because I didn't think it was enough. Yes, sisterhood binds them in a way, but I felt like, what these girls are doing is really terrible, so I needed them to be broken. And I needed them to have shared trauma, because I believe shared trauma further binds people together, and since they were sisters, the easiest thing was that the shared trauma would take place in their home. So that's kind of when the father was born in my mind. So he was really an answer to a problem I was trying to address with in
he
my
was
writing.
A prop.
yeah. He was, and then I kind of, in my own way, I won't say I fell in love with him, but because he looms so large in their minds, he started to loom quite large in mine, because he has so much to answer for, and he is so cruel, and in my mind he's just this bully. And that's why to your question about getting away with maybe not having a son, it might just be that he likes to be the center of his own universe. Like he doesn't need any male to be in his space, when he's kind of got everything on lockdown. So I found the father quite interesting, quite interesting to write, to be honest, and his obsession with his knife and just the way he performs for guests, so everybody outside of them will think that he's this great, fantastic guy, but the people in the home know that he's really a tyrant, which was something else I enjoyed doing.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I that insight of of being the center of attention and being the center of female attention is actually a very fascinating concept for me, because I didn't see it that way, but it's there actually. It really is there. He is, even the way his twin sister relates to him, it's this larger than life figure, and he enjoys it and he revels in it. And I can imagine that such a guy would have been totally not acceptable or totally not that much of a great father to a son, in a sense. Not bringing another male figure into that space would have been a bit too much to bear for the poor mother. I think she would be something much more than ambient, So, but let's talk about the noir space. I know Leye. I've seen some so you guys at festivals together, and Leo used to calls this interest in crime fiction from West Africa, Nigeria as sunshine noir. I love it so much. And what do you think about it? And this, every time I hear sunshine noir, I don't like categories much, but I always think about also the rise of Nollywood, and how people see Hollywood and all that. Do you see some kind of a parallel in terms of how people are so interested in what is happening in the continent, and especially in Nigeria? Especially also with your travels and the questions people are asking you, what do you think is responsible for this, maybe?
Just why does Leia call it sunshine noir?
I don't know. I think that was what
did he explain?
I think it's the sun, or maybe the tropicalness of it, because I think the Scandinavian
sounds so nice. Like, is this happy? I don't know. I'm just interested. I'll ask him when, like, sunshine noir. It sounds very kind of. It's an interesting
description. I have to ask him. Yeah, I think it has to. It's when you contrast it with the Scandinavian noir, which is also a lot of snow and lots of, like the Jill Nesbo book and all that. And then you look at about hours.
All the bad things here happen in the lights, happen in the daytime when the sun is shining.
Yes, exactly. And so I think that is it. But what do you think? Why do you think this is happening now? And, and what's the trend? Can you see what the trend is? Is it going to get as big as Nollywood? Is there hope?
I hope so. We need the money. I hope it gets as big as money.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a big question. I think, but there are different reasons for it. For one thing, I believe that Africans and Black Americans are looking to consume their own content a lot more than maybe they were in the past. Like, they're demanding their own content. We want to watch movies where we're the lead characters. We want to read books where and I think a lot of it as well, people, not only do they want to be, or do we want to be the leads, but we also don't want to be pigeonholed anymore. We don't want to see just the same narrative of, and again, there's value in that narrative, but there's so much more to us than the narratives that have been pushed thus far. And like, even for myself, coming across people who are just like, there was a time a woman thanked me and I was like, okay, she thanked me she was like, it was so refreshing to read about a beautiful curvy, and she was referring to Ayoola, she was like, I rarely come across a Black woman described so, that this woman is beautiful and is, and I thought, okay, it felt good to feel like, I had done that. Now there will also be other books that I have as well, but maybe people are not aware of them or haven't really had access to them. So I think that's one reason for the phenomenon. It's just that Black people are demanding it, and we're such a massive community that it makes sense for the publishers to publish it. It's all about the money at the end of the day, really. So there's that. I don't know. And to be honest, I feel like Africa is a continent that people have had their eyes on for some time. And, I think there will be a lot of great things to come from Africa in the next few years. So it's actually really exciting. I mean, if you think about the way the music industry has exploded, you know, there was a time where people didn't used to play Nigerian music at parties. I remember because I was alive. There was a time people didn't used to play at all. Now I can travel to, like, you know, wherever, Sweden, and hear a Nigerian, you know, hear Nigerian music and be like, okay, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I experienced that once. I went to the Maldives on holiday with my family, and it was this resort. And every night there was a party, and every night it was P Square, and every hotel staff, every hotel staff could sing each of these songs word for word. You know, they would have nights where they actually have. They even have nights where they actually have what do you call it, a karaoke, right? The karaoke thing, and they're singing Nigerian songs. Like it was very, very. It was a proud moment for me. I've always had a bit of a challenge with this whole African writing. What does it mean? What does African writing mean? You know, this award for African writing. And so one of the things that's always excited me about My Sister the Serial Killer is always this idea, or that the awards transcended African writing. The recognition transcended that's almost semi-genre, so to speak. How does that make you feel? And does that speak to how you see writing? Do you see yourself as a Nigerian writer? Do you see yourself as an African writer? Or do you see yourself as a writer?
I definitely see myself as just a writer. I would, I don't even really like the, you know, when people, okay, let me not say I don't like it, but like, I can only, you know, sometimes when people ask me questions about Africa or even Nigeria, you know, I'll tell you what I know, but I'm always very adamant about stressing that, you know, I can really only represent myself. I don't, you know, I can remember telling someone once, I was like, when you ask me about what's happening in the North, like, it's like you're here in London and I'm asking you about something that's going on in Scotland. You guys barely even go to Scotland. Like, I can't, you know, I've not even visited all the states in Nigeria. I can't account for everything in Nigeria. I hear about it on the news, same as everybody else. You know, so I think for me, it's always been very important to me that I be identified as Oyinkan Braithwaite first of all. But the thing is also, like, again, what I said about there being so much is coming out of the continent, like, I want to be a part of that movement. Like, I'm not going to distance myself from that movement. It'd be such a blessing to be named amongst, you know, some of these other fantastic African writers. And I've met so many of them that it's with pride that I would, you know, I'd hold my head up and say, yes, you know, I'm an African writer.
I'm an African writer.
Yes, but there are the limitations that come with it. And I think before that, you know, first of all, recognize the work for its own value, you know, recognize the work in its genre, recognize the work for what it's doing, and then, you know, everything else can come afterwards.
Okay, good. And we're wrapping up now. So I just want to wrap up with some short questions. One of the things that I do when I pick up a book is read the acknowledgements first. I always read the acknowledgements first, you know, and I was so fascinating. And your first sentence in your acknowledgement is, I think I will quickly check. It says, I'm grateful first to God. And I thought that was very fascinating. And of course, we know in the Nollywood movies, everything is, you know, thanks to God at the end. God is the director and the producer of this movie, you know, but this is the first time in a novel that I've seen a writer actually, you know, call out their faith. And I just wanted to know, what's the role of your faith in your writing, and how does it push your imagination, and how does it free you, and how does it limit or constrain you?
I don't know. I think both. I feel like sometimes it limits me and sometimes it frees me. It limits me sometimes because I write some really dark content and there's a limit sometimes there's a limit I have to place on myself because for different reasons. One, I don't want to bring anybody down. But also sometimes I'm like, what's the value in what you're creating here? And I have to find the value, even if it's dark. But at the same time, and also because I write about people doing bad things, and like you said, I mostly do without judgment. Sometimes I think about that. Is it all right that I'm not saying what I think people should do? Like, this is wrong, this is right. So there is those conversations I have to have with myself. But it also frees me because I know that he gave me this gift. And there were times before My Sister's Serial Killer came out that I used to have like conversations with God, and I'd be like, look, you didn't give me this gift for no reason. People feel like when you've done a debut, like that's when you arrived, that's when you were born, that's when everything just happened. But there was a journey way before then. And there were real struggle moments, and there were disappointments, and there were other things that happened before your debut comes out. So I do mean it when I say it, because there were times where I thought, should I maybe just set this thing aside and focus on something else, because I don't know if this is something I can really do.
Yeah, good. And so on that note, a series of questions. You're still a
fire
debut.
Round.
Yes, the fire round. You're still a debut. What are you working on now? When is it going to be out? What can we look forward to?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because I've worked on a lot of things since My Sister's Serial Killer. I've worked on several shorts. I think The Last Tattoo for Max Sweeney's, which is out. The Skull's Bridal for Audible. Amazon, my short story for Amazon, Treasure, in the Hush collection, just came out. There's a novella coming out in February called The Baby Is Mine. So look out for that. So those are some things I've been working on. I'm not working on a novel yet. I need to take a bit of a break. Okay,
good. And also, what would somebody asked this question, said, is there anything you would do differently? Something you would have liked to tell a younger Oyinkan at Kingston?
I was pretty consistent with my writing journey, to be honest. I don't know if there's anything I would do differently, because I stayed on course, to be honest. Like, I've dedicated everything to this whole writing thing, so I don't think there's anything. I would tell her, keep your head up, keep going, you're doing good.
Okay,
doing good.
Okay, and then another question came from somebody. What will you continue doing? A trait, a habit, an attitude that has served you well till now?
Okay, do you know what? This is the first thing that comes to mind. I don't know if it's the best example, but I don't let what people say to me, because people, especially I think if you're a woman, people are fond of telling you what they think you should do, and how they think you should do it. And I'm very polite. I will listen, and then I'll go off and do the thing that makes the most sense to me, or I'd have prayed about it or whatever. But there were a lot of like naysayers when it came to this writing thing before My Sister the Serial Killer. I remember an uncle once told me that in order to, since I insisted on being a writer, I would have to marry a rich man, find a rich man to marry. So, but I don't even hold, like, I'm cool with all these people that said all these things, but I knew the path I was on. So I think that's a trait that's helped me, that I never kind of,
wavered. Thank you. It was such a pleasure talking to you, Oyinkan. Thank you for your time.
I had fun.
And thank you for your warmth. And please, I hope that you keep doing what your heart tells you to do. And I'm so grateful for all the successes that My Serial Killer has had. And I think that it's a lot coming up. And I hear there's a movie, right?
I mean, they've optioned it, but I don't know if, when, how they will make it.
Okay, good. No problem. So I'm looking forward to your future successes, and we wish you all the best. Thank you for making us proud. We're very
thank you.
The story has helped us to stay the course. A lot of writers are so inspired by you, inspired by your story. But most of all, thank you for giving us this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Femi.